Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending where you're viewing this live stream. My name is Mustafa Aryan. I'm the Executive Director of Security, Gender and Development Institute, or SGDI. SGDI is an international network of experts producing research and events focused on a gendered analysis of international security topics. Today, SGDI hosts its final Fireside chat of 2021 under the title of Illicit Threat in Cybersecurity, a conversation with Dr. Layla Hashemi, moderated by Dr. Camilo Pardo. Camilo currently teaches at the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University, and he's a senior analyst at TraCCC at George Mason University. He worked extensively on humanitarian and land issues in Latin America. His intellectual and research interests include the political economy of development, corruption, and organized crime. He has worked for governments, for civil society, and for international organizations. He holds a PhD from George Mason University, United States, and MSc from University College London. This event will be in English and live translated in Spanish by Mónica Méndez Caballero. Mónica is Associate at the UNESCO Chair on Sociocultural Anticipation and Resilience for LSE. Mónica's practice and research interests focus on policy design for inclusive peace and development. She regularly contributes to the training programs and publications of Geneva Center for Security Policy, and she is guest speaker on security sector reform, strategic foresight, and gender mainstreaming. Mónica currently serves as a program manager at SGDI, and she is member of AMASRO, Women in Security and Defense in Latin America and the Caribbean. After the keynote address, we will have a Q&A session. We invite you to take part in this event by asking a question in the comment section. And you can also engage with us and with each other on Twitter with today's hashtag SGDI and SGDI Fireside. Today's program will be concluded by Smita Singh. Smita is an Assistant Committee Officer in the Committee on External Affairs, Parliament of India. Previously, she held the position of Assistant Professor in the Department of Political Science at Lady Shri Ram College for Women, University of Delhi. Smita has completed her master's in politics with a specialization in international relations and master's in philosophy from the School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. She has been awarded a senior research fellowship in both international relations and political science from the University Grants Commission. Her areas of expertise are foreign policy analysis, comparative government, strategic and nuclear policy, and gender politics. I would like to thank you all for attending today's event, and I am delighted to welcome Camilo to begin our program. Over to you, Camilo.
Thanks, Mustafa. It is really a pleasure for me to be here in the company of such interesting people. I have now the pleasure of presenting to you Dr. Layla Hashemi, today's speaker. Layla is a researcher and data analyst at the Terrorism and Transnational Crime and Corruption Center at George Mason University, where she focuses on international supply chains, cybercrime, and illicit trade. She currently spends most of her time on the NSF project Disturbing Operations of Illicit Supply Networks, where she analyzes the supply chains of counterfeit personal protective equipment, fentanyl, and pharmaceuticals. Layla earned her PhD in public policy at George Mason University's Schar School, and her master's in international relations and comparative politics at New York University, with a concentration in Middle Eastern and Islamic studies. She has held positions at governmental and non-governmental organizations, including Forum 2000 and the Journal of Civil Society, where she is currently managing editor. Her volunteer work includes moderating the Anti-Corruption Advocacy Network. She's also board member and research manager at the Security, Gender, and Development Institute, and a political economy project coordinator at the Arab Studies Institute. She has presented her research, among other places, at NATO, the United Nations, and professional conferences, workshops, and webinars. Her work has been published in the Washington Post, academic journals, books, and other outlets. She co-edited and contributed to the upcoming Routledge volume, Antiquities, Trafficking in the Real and Virtual World, which will see the light next year. She did this with TRAC's director, Dr. Louise Shelley. So again, it is my big pleasure to be here with you. And I turn over the floor to you, Layla. I very much look forward to hearing your presentation.
Thank you so much, Camilo. Thank you, everyone. Welcome. Let me just get the slides going. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning. My name is Layla Hashemi. As Camilo just so nicely introduced me, I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at GMU's TRAC, and I'm very excited to speak with you today about our research. I just wanted to give a quick and very big thank you to Camilo Pardo, Dr. Camilo Pardo, for moderating this conversation, to Monica for her wonderful interpretation. Again, to remind you, if you would like to listen to this speech in Spanish, you can hit the interpretation button at the bottom right and switch to Spanish, and you will hear Monica's wonderful voice. To Mustafa for our wonderful introduction, and to Smita, who will be live tweeting this event as we move along. Okay, so today I will briefly discuss two of our TRAC projects, one on antiquities trafficking and another on counterfeit PPE and pharmaceuticals. I'll briefly share our data, research data, methods, and findings, and then I will discuss similarities and differences in these trades and their convergence with other forms of transnational crime. I'm happy to answer any questions. Feel free to speak in the chat or ask your questions in the chat as I present, as I would love for this to be a sort of interactive session. But first, why counterfeits? So counterfeiting is the largest criminal enterprise in the world. Sales of counterfeit goods and pirated goods total $1.7 trillion each year, which is more than that for drugs or human trafficking. In 2018, Interpol seized over 13 million doses of counterfeit drugs worth $180 million. And keep in mind that this is illicit financing of one product in one region. Fake goods also harm the reputation of brands and their partners, fund other forms of illicit trade, and threaten to harm consumers through the circulation of substandard products in legitimate supply chains. You can see in the graph here that most counterfeits are common items such as clothing, footwear, and electronics, showing how widespread this problem really is. Who in this room does not own dozens, if not hundreds, of products in these categories? So to give you a background on the Classy project, I will briefly outline its context and its objectives. First, as we all know, both Iraq and Syria are heavily impacted by war that is associated with ISIS terrorism. This led to a surge in the looting of archaeological sites across the region, as well as the production of counterfeits. It's widely believed that the trafficking of these objects generates substantial revenue for conducting acts of terrorism. So therefore, the Classy project's aim was to collect and analyze primary data and to investigate these complex and non-transparent trafficking processes. The data was predominantly gathered from publicly available online sources where antiquities trade is concentrated, which provides globally reaching, no questions asked sales opportunities. In this image on the right, for example, we can see how social media platforms such as Facebook are used to advertise and sell potentially looted objects. We use various digital tools in our research to test the most effective methods for online investigation and countering this type of transnational crime. The research also acknowledged that one major stimuli of the trafficking is the global demand, and therefore we sought for ways to promote responsible purchase and collection of ancient objects. So to implement the Class C project, a multilingual team of archaeologists, antiquities specialists, and criminal network investigators carried out the analysis of the current state of the online market. The research was approached from two angles. So first, on the left, you can see during our online sales monitoring, we analyzed the general nature of the antiquities market, traded materials and their flows, as well as illegitimate practices employed in transactions. We examined over 60 sites, ranging from large internationally recognized galleries to small-scale independent dealers operating on more decentralized e-commerce marketplaces such as eBay. The monitoring focused on small objects such as coins and cuneiform, as these are easily concealed and transported and thus less likely to be detected while in transit. This is the reason for which they are traded in large quantities. This image on the left depicts antiquities seized in 2016 during a raid on Islamic State fighters in Syria that were later returned to Iraq by the United States. And this is just one of many examples of a similar nature, which demonstrates the importance of understanding the value and dynamics of this trade. Second, we deepened our understanding of sales networks through participant observation on social media. We monitored some of the most popular social media platforms, which I'm sure a lot of you are part of, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And we found that venues like eBay and Etsy are unique in that they're interactive sales platforms with social media elements. They fit in sort of both categories of marketplaces and social media, and therefore have the biggest type of potential for this kind of research. So through the use of relatively simple tools such as web scrapers or spiders, we were able to automate much of our monitoring. These web scrapers facilitate pulling information like the listing number, description, and price of an object into data spreadsheets for easy review by subject matter experts. With this method, we were able to use our resources where they were needed most. This blending of automated and manual analysis allowed us to streamline the listings monitoring process. And as I mentioned before, we found that many objects were being sold on websites like Etsy, not as antiquities, but as craft or hobby goods. And we discovered that many online forums and social media sites contained valuable sales information, which led us to monitor venues like Facebook and the dark web. We worked with several other tools, which I won't explain in detail here, but we also collaborated with computational social scientists to gather and analyze our data. We partnered with Cyari, you can see their graphic here, a data analytics company, and we used Know Your Customer tools such as Butler, shown here with the little hand, to investigate online identities in the open and the dark web. And it's important to note here that we found no evidence of illicit coin or cuneiform sales on the dark web. And this can be explained by the fact that the antiquities market is a gray market. This is where licit and illicit goods are mixed, making them difficult to distinguish, but also generally easy to trade without needing to use the dark web. So in our methodology, we developed an approach that blended listings and social media monitoring, allowing us to obtain a more holistic perspective on the trade. Okay, so our sales monitoring led us to several findings. It's now confirmed there is no reliable way of determining from online images whether any specific object was originally found in Syria, Iraq, or elsewhere, or whether something is a counterfeit, which I know is very disappointing probably in terms of findings. But this is due to the low quality of images, especially of items of low levels of preservation or unclean items. Thus, that means that they are potentially freshly dug out of the ground. Next, many objects are sold with problematic or no provenance at all, which prevents us from determining when they came out of the ground and from understanding their ownership history. A growing problem that goes hand in hand with an internet-based trade is that antiquities are often sold not as artifacts, but as toys, educational tools, jewelry-making components, or curiosities. Genuine and illegally traded antiquities are often mixed together, which has been termed piggybacking. Sellers and buyers in a lot of illicit trade often use false accounts or alter egos when engaging in this online trade. This obscures their identities and hinders our ability to track their transactions. And finally, although it's not possible to relate specific financial flows to terrorist activity, and the trade did not seem to be as valuable as previously assumed, it becomes clear that ISIS and other criminal groups indeed make revenues from antiquities trafficking. Okay, so now to keep everyone awake, we're going to have a poll, and to make this a little bit more engaging. And the poll question, no wrong answers here, is what is the most popular digital marketplace? And so let me see if I can launch it from here. Oops. Polls. So your options here are Alibaba, Amazon, eBay, and Mercado Libre. And again, keep in mind that this is for both licit and illicit goods. So just, take your best shot at what is the most popular marketplace. I see some answers are trickling in. Excellent. So the poll is working. I'll give everyone about 10 more seconds. Okay, I'm going to end the poll in 3, 2, 1. All right, so hopefully I can share the results and everyone can see them. So we have 27% with Alibaba, 73% with Amazon, and surprisingly, no one for eBay or Mercado Libre, which is fine. Thank you for answering our poll. So the answer is it really depends. It depends on where you live or what country you're talking about. So different marketplaces are more popular in various parts of the world. For example, we can see in this graphic that in the US, Amazon is quite popular, whereas Mercado Libre is more popular in Central and South America. And then we see that Alibaba is very popular in China. And by the way, if you'd like to introduce yourself in the chat and tell us where you're from and what language you're listening in on, that would be great. So marketplaces and social media have many things in common. They have instant 24-hour access at very low costs. There are also very low barriers of entry for participation. Anyone with an internet connection can browse, buy, and even sell on these platforms. But then they also have very important differences. And I'm sorry, it's cut off here, but there's a hierarchy or vetting process. So in a marketplace, we often have a clear buyer and a clear seller, and there's some sort of vetting process allowing the seller to sell on this platform versus on social media where anyone can kind of be a seller. And then we have a one-to-one versus a one-to-many model. So while both social media and marketplaces work on a one-to-many model to begin with, social media sales often move to a one-to-one or encrypted messaging to complete their transaction, or to continue their conversation. So think of like a Venmo for payment or a Cash App. Versus on marketplaces, one vendor is often advertising to many customers, which brings me to my last point. There are different methods of payment. Most social media does not have payment processors. In contrast, on marketplaces, consumers can browse, add to cart, and complete their transaction without ever leaving the site. We also see different national level policies and regulations for marketplaces. So for instance, the recent removal or request to remove Wish by French officials based on product safety concerns. So an investigation into Wish reported particular concerns over family-related products, with 95% of toys and electronic devices inspected to be found as non-compliant. So again, 95% of toys and electronics inspected as non-compliant should be very worrisome for those of us that are shopping for the holidays. The examples here include jewelry sets, a children's mermaid costume, and LED Christmas lights. So I think that's an important part that we can get into in the discussion. Oops. But as a professor and an educator, I can't just leave you hanging without some sort of answer. So let's look at the traffic of global marketplaces to see who has the most hits or the most visits. So at the very tippy top, most of you are right, congratulations, we see Amazon with over 5 billion visits per month. And then next we see eBay with 1.7 billion visits per month. eBay, as I mentioned before, is a popular platform for the sale and purchase of ancient coins, as we discovered in our Classy project. And notice that these are marketplaces, not social media platforms. At the same time, I think it's really important to point out that platforms like Facebook are now quickly shifting to offering more in-house payments to closely mimic this marketplace model. So if you're familiar with Facebook stores, users can not only browse products and reviews, but also purchase these goods within the same app or website, allowing the company more revenue as users spend more time using their products. So there's a very much, I see a blurring of boundaries with these marketplaces and social media. Okay, so what kinds of products are consumers buying on these marketplaces? As we discussed in the very beginning, mostly this is fashion, arts and crafts, which could now be stolen or looted antiquities, homewares, and electronics. And keep in mind that all of these goods can be counterfeit, and that often little is being done to ensure these fakes don't pass as authentic products. These two graphics here demonstrate that the top product categories of things that are sold on these marketplaces overlaps with the top counterfeit good seizures. We also see in the graphic on the right that most products of intellectual property rights seizures in the US originate from China, Hong Kong, and India. And this is something that we've very much confirmed with a lot of our track research. So you can see here in the graphic, the red circle, that China is responsible for nearly 80% of IPR seizures in the US. Okay. Oh, that's not what was supposed to happen. I clicked a link instead of doing the thing I was supposed to do. There we go. I have linked everything in case you want my sources. Okay, so next on to our second project. We just finished our first year of a 5-year NSF grant tracking supply chains of PPE and pharmaceuticals. Counterfeit PPE, I should say, and pharmaceuticals. And we have seen a convergence between these trades in that many online pharmaceutical websites have also recently began to advertise COVID-related products. So in terms of counterfeit PPE, we're mostly investigating supply chains of respirators, face masks, nitrile gloves, and other medical equipment. But the criminals do not stop here. We see listings for COVID-19 tests, vaccination cards, and even vaccines themselves. And then on to pharmaceuticals. The value of the counterfeit drug or pharmaceutical market is $200 billion a year. Internet sales of these counterfeit drugs account for $75 billion of the total market. And an estimated 80% of the counterfeit drugs that are consumed in the United States come from overseas. Most of the counterfeit drugs that have been manufactured are manufactured either in India and China, and the World Health Organization estimates that between 1 and 10% of drugs sold around the world are counterfeits, and these numbers can be even higher, as high as 50% in some countries. So with relation to pharma, we're looking not just at pills and scheduled medicines in their final forms, but also active pharmaceutical ingredients or APIs and precursor chemicals, which often come in powder form, and often, as I mentioned before, originate in countries such as China and India, where these products are not scheduled or regulated. For instance, on the bottom right here, we can see a listing for iso, or isotonazine, which is an opioid analgesic, a brown chemical with a very high potency, more than that of fentanyl. And if any of you were following the opioid epidemic, at least in the United States, fentanyl is quite strong. So these are really important precursors to look at that are kind of synthetics that are taking over the opioid sales. So through our grant research, we have contributed to the seizure of over 55 million counterfeit respirators, the takedown of over 25,000 deceptive social media posts, and the removal of over 28,000 fraudulent e-commerce offerings. We were able to conduct this research and make such a strong impact through innovative approaches, such as our private-public partnership with 3M. We are constantly in collaboration with governments as well as private companies, including brands, and these partners provide critical information and data on seizures, raids, customs, and other affairs. And with this large scope of data, we use a multidisciplinary approach and advanced data analytics. We have experts from a variety of fields: public policy, computer science, and engineering. And then in our research, we conduct cyber investigations of online trade, as well as shipping research that allows us to track the entire supply chain from source through transit onto destination markets. So speaking of supply chains, here is a graphic on supply chains. So when we look at illicit supply chains, or licit supply chains, to be honest, objects are moving from source through transit onto their destination countries or locations. And it's important to note that state actors can be involved or turn a blind eye to the trafficking or transnational crime, whatever the crime is, at any of these points, demonstrating the corruption that facilitates these crimes. Countries can also be placed in more than one category, serving as, for instance, both key transit and destination countries. And I think we'll get to this in a little bit, but there's also an important role of free ports or free trade zones. These are high security and high privacy locations. They're free from duties and taxes. And so these free ports serve as a sort of a one-stop shop, if you will, for traffickers or smugglers. According to the OECD and the European Union Intellectual Property Office, every new FTZ or free trade zone drives a 5.9% increase in the value of counterfeit exports. And then we also see here in the graphic supply chain route trends. So mostly we're seeing objects, specifically counterfeit respirators, moving from China as the origin through Hong Kong, Peru, and South Korea onto our destination markets in the West, such as the US and countries in the EU. And then another nice little graphic for you. So based on our global raids and seizures data of counterfeit respirators presented here, we found that China is not only the top exporter, but also one of the largest importers of counterfeit respirators. So you can see China right over here. China's number of raids and seizures by quantity is approximately 4.7 million. And that's only second to the United States, where we've seized over 32 million respirators, which is about 60% of the global total so far. And these graphics, I should say, are current up to August 2021. Canada, Hong Kong, Peru, and the UK all had over 2 million pieces seized as of August 2021, while the UAE and Spain seized nearly 1 million respirators. We also have other cases that we examined revealing sales in European countries such as Australia, Romania, and the United Kingdom, really showing the global scope of this trade. And we are excited to report that our work with 3M has led to them winning the World Trademark Review's 2021 North America Team of the Year for its work in detecting and disrupting counterfeits. Yay! Many of these fake products were destined for major hospitals and healthcare facilities where medical personnel are working tirelessly to stop the spread of the virus. So we're thrilled that our work has been able to protect frontline workers and other consumers by preventing these counterfeits from entering legitimate supply chains. As Dr. Shelley, TraCCC director, explains here, this collaboration with 3M represents a new research model that combines policy and technology in support of American industry and human life. Okay, so from our research on both of these kind of fronts, we can identify several patterns and trends in this counterfeit trade. First, we're dealing with very complex supply chains. These are truly transnational and global networks. Many of the products originate from China and are sold to Western markets in the US and Europe. Second, we see the use of fake documents or fake or false certification. So these fake documents falsely legitimize counterfeit products and lead to unknowing consumption of substandard products, illicit medicines, looted artifacts, and other illicit goods. And third, and perhaps most importantly, we see a role of legitimate businesses or legitimate actors in general. So some of the largest tech companies are involved in facilitating this trade, from social networking products such as WhatsApp or WeChat to discuss and advertise products, to the use of Google's voice service, to fake phone numbers and locations. No company is safe from being abused to sell counterfeits. No company. It's also important to note the role of registrars that provide the domains for this illicit trade. So if you know of the GoDaddies, the Alibabas, these registrars that actually provide these websites to these illicit actors. Our research found that LinkedIn, one of the most widely used and respected networking sites with over 700 million users, I'm sure many of you are on LinkedIn, was often used to facilitate counterfeit respirator supply chains. And then next we see a commingling of products and convergence with other forms of illicit trade. So for example, we can see here that the same user selling counterfeit Xanax on TikTok is selling counterfeit 3M masks on Facebook. So we see cross-platform advertising. And then finally, we have various business models and payment methods. Criminals use an array of information and sources to promote their business. Whether they are a business to customer or business to business model, sellers aim to reach the largest audience possible while avoiding detection to successfully sell their fake and likely dangerous products with impunity. Okay, so with that kind of glum and sad note, where do we go from here? We're facing three very important challenges. First, we're investigating gray markets with blurred boundaries where sellers combine licit and illicit goods to avoid detection and potentially fund violence and other crimes. A second major challenge is that there's corruption that facilitates all of these illicit acts. This ranges from the role of legitimate businesses, like I just spoke about, the involvement of the state, and the laundering of goods through false documents. And this issue really can't be overstated. The lack of clear provenance remains one of our biggest problems, I think, in any supply chain. We need, I think, more of a broader view of provenance that promotes responsible and ethical sourcing of materials and consumption of products. And finally, there's been a flooding of the market with counterfeits and fakes as this highly profitable trade attracts actors seeking to increase their sales and revenue. New technologies are improving the quality of counterfeits, and the democratization of the market and sort of e-commerce in general has introduced new actors who are often ill-equipped to detect these fakes. Counterfeits corrupt legitimate supply chains and pose threats to national security and public health, as we saw in the case of the counterfeit respirators. So this really shows our need to develop regulations that address the specific challenges of online trade. We must make efforts to decrease the demand for counterfeits and to promote responsible consumption. Buyers and consumers should be made aware that the lack of due diligence not only threatens national security and public health, but also promotes the production of forgeries, and that all this together can finance other crimes. And with these methods, we can successfully combat illicit supply chains through the use of powerful tools capable of tracking transnational crime in the digital era. So just to wrap it up, more details about our projects and research findings can be found on TRAC's website, which is tracccc.gmu.edu, including our Antiquities report, which was released in 2018. And then we're also very excited to announce our forthcoming book titled Antiquities Smuggling in the Real and Virtual World, which should be released with Routledge in January 2022. Thank you very much for your time and attention, and I look forward to our discussion.
Well, thank you, Layla, for such an interesting presentation. So let me start with a few questions before our audience warms up and starts asking you the very hard questions, the very direct questions that I'm sure everyone has. Your presentation mentioned 3 key nodes in supply chains. And I was wondering if you could explain more about the role of transit locations and how these transshipment points help sustain this illicit supply chains.
Absolutely, right. So I think that the transit nodes are very much where goods are laundered. So first, to kind of address the issue of free ports or free trade zones to launder money and goods. So this increases the complexity and makes these crimes even more difficult to trace. So I mentioned this a bit in the presentation, but free trade zones have very high levels of security and privacy. And because of this, these free zones serve as safe havens for illicit trade. And so what happens at these nodes is that there's a storing or warehousing at these transit locations, and then criminals will use this opportunity to launder the product. And what I mean by launder the product here is not like money laundering launder, but to actually create fake documentation or authentication, certification for transport. So for example, you could label a package or parcel as a different material or HS code, right, as you know, Camilo, in the product transport documents, so in the bill of lading or in the invoices. So rather than saying these are counterfeit masks, you might say that this is, I don't know, just some other type of textile. And so this is where you can really break the chain in terms of the supply chain and really make it so that you are scrubbing clean the sort of illicit trail that, you know, investigators or researchers like us would be able to follow. And it really makes sense because we see, like, for instance, Aicheon Airport, which is a free trade zone in South Korea, being like, we have certain free trade zones that tend to serve as hubs that illicit actors know that they can use. And then I think generally, the more complex these actors make the supply chains, the more difficult it is to track them. So rather than just going from point A to point Z, if you have a bunch of points in between, it just makes it more difficult to track.
Great. So when you think of issues like this, I like to bring things closer to, to a real life, because when you start to analyze things like this in the cyber domain and illicit networks, you tend to think that they're way out there, very, very far away, and they don't directly link to the way in which we all live our daily lives. So I like to bring things closer because I think that's easier to understand all of these elements. So when you're trying to think about why do we have all of these solutions, why do we have free trade zones that facilitate illicit trade so much, you come to understand that advocates often argue for their efficiency in terms of cost or delivery times, and also how these all of these solutions facilitate the permanent availability of wider stocks of merchandise. So in short, all of people who argue for these solutions, they argue about the benefits that they bring to international trade. Basically, to have things shipped from one place to another and to our doorstep at a click on our smartphone, right? Things that we really like to, that we really enjoy. So we find ourselves stuck between allowing free trade of goods to satisfy our likes, our demands, or imposing regulations on this trade in order to curb illegal commodities, but at the expense of how we love to have things delivered to our doorstep, right? So I was wondering, what do you think about this perspective? And if anything, what could payment methods companies or these type of platforms or any of the different actors that play a role in international trade could do in order to kind of balance these two, I would say, urgent needs?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we are kind of moving from a purely physical world into sort of digital consumption, as you said. And this has led to a huge flood in intellectual property rights crime, financial fraud schemes, and other crimes. And I think here, the title of the talk is Cybersecurity, but we could even take the cyber out at this point, because I think we're just talking about security in general, right? A broader view of security. When we say cybersecurity, we're really just talking about security as 50% of all crimes now have a cyber component to them. And I think that COVID-19 brought an increase in both traditional crimes. When we think of homicides, there's a 25% increase from 2019 to 2020 in gun crime, but also in, like what you're saying, these counterfeits and these substandard goods. And so we can kind of approach this from two angles. We can look at the end user and educate the end user. So we can decrease demand for counterfeits and increase awareness of these harmful products and the other vulnerabilities that accompany this rise in digital marketplaces and financial transactions. So in one sense, it's about digital literacy, and it's about making people aware of the impact and the consequences of their consumption. There's also this need to learn about the sourcing of your products. So as you're asking, Camilo, people just want things faster, cheaper, better, and they're not necessarily, I don't think, thinking of the sourcing of the materials. They're not really ruminating on the impact environmentally, economically. We have these shipping shortages, these supply chain shortages. We have really, I think, ramped up, and we have very high expectations, as you mentioned, for our sort of global consumption these days. And so being able to kind of track back and be a little bit more mindful in your consumption, I think, at the end user level would be very helpful. And then again, promoting digital literacy and responsible cyber practices to not become vulnerable to these cyber and financial crimes that happen online. So making users aware of cybercrime red flags so they can kind of avoid these traps. and just generally increase security and protection and privacy through the use of things that a lot of us are already using. So two-factor authentication, encryption. A lot of people, especially in Iran, where I'm from, the developing world, know about virtual private networks and sort of other measures. And then in terms of the platforms and how they can help is, I think my first thing, my catchphrase has been admit that you have a problem, right? So we just went over a bunch of these marketplaces, Amazon, Alibaba. I think a lot of brands and companies and people generally are reluctant to admit that there is a problem of counterfeiting or a problem of substandard goods. And then a lot of times they also are not qualified to identify these counterfeits, right? So when we're talking about respirators, for instance, it's very like there's a subject matter expertise that you need to have to be able to know if something is a counterfeit. So first it would just be admit you have a problem. And then second would be partner with researchers, subject matter experts to develop anti-illicit trade strategies, and share your data, right? So our small team could not have contributed to the seizure of 55 million respirators if we didn't have this sort of close collaboration with 3M. We had tremendous amounts of trust and data transparency in this public-private partnership. And the sort of whole of society and multidisciplinary approach and the use of smart data, I think, is the most effective way forward to detecting and disrupting these illicit supply chains.
Right. Great. Thank you. I like to invite the audience, if you have any questions, to just write them in the chat box. I will be happy to share those with Layla. But in the meantime, let's speak about COVID, which I guess since last year, it has to come into any sort of discussion that tries to analyze current affairs at a global scale. So I was wondering, from your perspective and from your experience, how have you seen the pandemic impacting cybersecurity? And I'm thinking specifically, for example, how have consumer demand and supply chains evolved with the increase in e-commerce, especially during the last, let's say, 18 months?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that we've all been heavily impacted by the pandemic. I think one really big aspect is that there's this huge increase in remote working or teleworking, which has this sort of like sharp rise also in e-commerce and has left individuals and companies more vulnerable to cyber attacks, online fraud, and really COVID myths and disinformation, which is something I didn't really talk about in the presentation, but I think is really important in terms of the spread of the virus. So criminals are definitely capitalizing on the chaos caused by COVID-19. Illicit actors play off of fear, right? A lot of times, especially when it comes to cyber crimes. So this recent global crisis is the perfect opportunity, if you think about it, to exploit these insecurities in both the physical and digital spaces. So people were worried about the spread of the virus and global supply chain shortages. Remember the shortage of toilet paper and all these different products. So consumers were much more susceptible to cybercrime. So since COVID-19, we've seen a rise in ransomware, phishing attacks, and more importantly, I think financial crimes at almost all levels. So this is against individuals, companies, financial institutes, and governments. We see money laundering through decentralized finance, healthcare-related fraud, just all sorts of illicit acts. Actually, what we found in our research is that many of the ads for COVID-19 products are actually non-delivery scams. And so what does this mean? That rather than actually delivering the final product and shipping the final good, sellers simply use these listings to collect personal data, such as your credit card number and other financial information, so that they can, steal your money. And then we also see an increase in the scale and speed of crimes and cyber attacks on the financial sector. So there's actually 80% of banks in the US and financial institutions in the US reported a year-on-year rise in cyber attacks in 2020. So I think that we are making ourselves a bit more vulnerable. And because we had this very quick shift into tele and remote working, all of these vulnerabilities were produced that we're still kind of catching up with, if that makes sense. We definitely see a lot of like the elderly populations, like certain groups of people I think are more susceptible. People that, again, don't have that digital literacy, don't have that a bit availability or knowledge to know what a counterfeit site might look like. For instance, a big trend that we've seen is like the spoofing of emails and the spoofing of websites. So like even 3M's own website has been spoofed, or their emails have been spoofed, meaning that someone might get an email that looks very legitimately like it's coming from a trusted brand, and it's actually a cyber criminal that's trying to get your banking information. So I think that these problems already existed, but they've just been exacerbated by the pandemic.
Great, thanks. We have a question from Will Nelson, and he is interested in the role of the state in this illicit counterfeit markets. So his question is, do you see any coordination with governments to move these illicit and counterfeit goods? For example, Iran and North Korea have been accused of using state resources to produce counterfeit goods as a way to earn currency, hard currency, and stave off sanctions. Have you come across any of this, or can you say a few words on the role of governments?
Yeah, so I think that goes, thank you for the question, Will, that it goes very much back to this idea of corruption and states turning a blind eye to this kind of illicit trade happening within their borders or across their borders. Turkey is another great example where we see very much a transition hub for transnational crime. And in short, I guess it brings them revenue, and so they're not necessarily doing a lot to counter it. In relation to PPE, we see a lot of Asian countries that are involved in this, and they're not necessarily taking the proper actions, preventative measures, or even really just acknowledging that the problem is happening, because they're likely either being bribed or paid off or somehow benefiting from this situation. And I think this all kind of comes back to the transnational and sort of global nature of this, where it's the problem of no one's going to get a pat on the back for having, admitted that they had a problem. And there's a tremendous amount of resources and work that needs to go into kind of detecting and disrupting these illicit supply chains. So if you're not going to be praised for stopping it, why would you kind of spend your resources there? And again, I think it also goes back to this whole, what can platforms and payments systems do, is you have to admit that you have a problem. And a lot of states, I think, are not willing to do just that. They don't want to admit that their country is sort of involved in this illicit trade. And then some of it's just sort of deep rooted in the way that these countries are run, where you have sort of even collaboration between organized criminals or illicit actors in the state, or that they kind of go hand in hand, and one person can be part of both of those groups. So yeah, thanks for the question.
Great. We have another really interesting question from the audience, this time from Casey Kennard. And she would like to know a little bit about the role of free trade zones in trying to crack down on illicit trade. So what are they doing? Are they doing something? What is their role? Or are they just all ignoring the problem? And this goes back to my initial question on how we facilitate trade, but at the same time, we're facilitating illicit trade. So free trade zones is one of these solutions that the world came up with in pretty much recent years. Free trade zones, I think, are an invention of the last 30 years to make trade more efficient. So what are their role? I was wondering if you could say, from your experience in the two projects, or just in general.
Yeah, no, that's free trade zones I think should be like the topic of everyone's talks in 2022. I see free trade zones as being like countries of their own. They have sort of their own autonomy. They are their own little sections, and they're cropping up all the time. I don't know of any particular free trade zone that's trying to crack down on this illicit trade. I do know that in the antiquities world, we have like the Geneva Free Port and certain case studies where I think people have become more aware of the trafficking of cultural property or heritage through these trade routes, and so there's maybe a bit more of an eye toward those towards those FTZs. But at the same time, as Camilo mentions, these FTZs or these free ports or these free trade zones were intended to promote trade. And so part of their whole existence is to not hinder or hamper or stifle any sort of transaction. And because there are so few regulations, so you don't need to really claim or document anything like very much that you're doing through these free trade zones. There's not a lot that can be done in terms of regulating the trade that's happening in them. And I think it's because exactly what I was saying, that that they were intended to promote trade and make it more seamless to promote trade. So I don't think that they want to be more regulated, and that's not to kind of ignore the fact that they're also just key transit locations that we see that aren't free trade zones, for instance, like warehouses, right? So free trade zones play a big role in antiquities trade, but in others, in the fact that they will often be used as a place to warehouse the goods or store the goods. And so criminal actors do this all the time. They, ship a bunch of parcels or, whatever was on the cargo ship or in the plane, and then they hide it out at a secondary location until the heat has kind of died down, right? And then as soon as it's safe to actually transport or ship the product, they will do so. And so I think that's another big aspect, is there's like this lag time or this strategic timing of the shipments to make sure that these criminals are not detected. So free trade zones are often used to like store art, to store other goods until the public has no longer been looking for that cuneiform or that statue, and then 10 or 20 years later, the dealer will go ahead and sell it. So yeah, great question.
Yeah, agree. Free trade zones are a key element in when you analyze all of these illegal trades. If you have a question, but you want to type it in Spanish, I will be happy to translate that too. Or Monica could also help you with that. So if you you have a very interesting question, but you want to type it in Spanish, we could also manage that. But in the meantime, Layla, you briefly touched upon overlapping trades, so convergence of different illicit trades. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what types of other illicit trades you see overlapping with counterfeit supply chains of PPEs or antiquities.
Yes, I love that question, because that is like really at the heart of what TRAC does, is look at the convergence of all these different types of illicit trades. And this is one of my favorite questions. So all sorts of trade that we see kind of overlapping. We see trade in weapons, narcotics, cybercrime, as I just mentioned, and financial crime like money laundering, fraud, etc. And the sale of other COVID-19 related products. So we have vaccine cards, test kits, and even the vaccines themselves. So just one anecdote recently, with looking at illicit pharmaceuticals, we see a lot of these pharmaceutical sites, so selling like the fentanyls or the isotonazines that I just mentioned. They also now have cropped up with a COVID-19 tab all of a sudden, selling antibiotics, selling these home remedies or cures. So this convergence is really key, as it shows that the criminals are operating during the pandemic are in large part working with or in collaboration with pre-existing networks. For instance, we see a large role played by legitimate businesses that are knowingly or unknowingly facilitating these illicit supply chains. Through our research again on this NSF grant, we've seen that many sellers that are dealing counterfeit respirators were previously textile companies, right? So selling apparel, clothing, maybe even footwear, and then they strategically changed their business scope to include production of respirators and masks to profit from the sort of surge in demand for these products. So what's interesting is we see so many of these companies that we're following are kind of popping up around mid-2020, right as the pandemic, right as the demand for respirators and masks was really up there, showing that they were directly responding to the increased need for PPE. And so I think what's important to note, in addition to the free trade zones and kind of the map of the source, transit, and destination countries, that a lot of these criminals are not reinventing the wheel. The same trade routes, for instance, are being used to facilitate weapons smuggling, narcotics trafficking, and then now counterfeit PPE.
Great. So we have 3 more minutes for our conversation. So to end up on a positive note, I guess, I was wondering if you have any, if you can think of any proposed legislation or any novel strategy to address all of this illegal trade and that you are excited about.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm very excited about President Biden's sort of rollout of all this sort of anti-corruption legislation and just sort of activity. I think that we really like corruption. Again, if anyone had like a title for their 2022 talks, it should be corruption, because I think corruption is really like the glue that allows for all of this to happen. In terms of U.S. legislation, I'm pretty excited about Shop Safe and the Inform Acts. These are both sort of legislations that will try to help protect consumers, and in a certain sense is kind of keeping in check these platforms like the Amazons and the others, to allow them to vet any third-party sellers. So I think what's really interesting is that, as we were talking about, we have this new era where we want things fast and cheap and 2-day or 1-day delivery or next day delivery. And I think consumers really need to start to understand that Amazon isn't the whole world, and that a lot of times there are third-party sellers on the Amazon platform that are really selling you the product, and Amazon is just fulfilling the shipment end. But we see this logo and we kind of assume that they're all one and the same. And so again, I think that at a sort of personal or micro level, to be more cognizant of the products that we're consuming, whether it's children's toys for the upcoming holiday season or respirators for frontline hospital workers, I think that it really starts with the everyday person and sort of stifling or diminishing this demand, and just being more digitally responsible, but also consuming the goods that we consume in a more responsible way and understanding where they're sourced.
Great. Excellent. Layla, thank you very much. Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation and for a very interesting discussion. I'm going to give the floor to Smita, who will be providing you with very interesting information for the near future and SGDI.
Thank you, Dr. Pardo. On behalf of SGDI, I would like to convey my sincere gratitude to Dr. Layla M. Hashemi for a very rich, insightful, and a very fascinating discussion on cybersecurity and illicit trade. And I also would like to wish you all the best for your upcoming book on Antiquities Smuggling in Real and Virtual World. And we really hope to have a book launch on this. Next, I would like to thank Dr. Camilo Pardo for being such a delightful moderator and, carrying this forward with such a beautiful, I would say, at once I was wondering why I need to learn a lot from the moderator with the kind of, enthusiasm he's showing on this particular issue. So thank you once again. And finally, Mustafa, thanks for the introductory remarks. And Monica, thumbs up to you for a brilliant and smooth interpretation and making our SGDI events, one grade up with your, live interpretation. Since we are drawing, close towards the end of this year, I would take this opportunity to wish everyone a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. We are also looking forward to a very eventful year ahead with the beginning of, our next SGDI chat in February 2022 and more. And we do hope that you will be joining us for all our future events and activities. Once again, thank you, everyone. Thank you.